Welcome all to attend this Wednesday webinar. We'll kick off in a couple of minutes, just waiting for people who are turning up late. Marco, how many coffees so far today?
How many?
Yeah.
Two.
Phil?
Just one for me. The next one coming up.
Gavin?
I feel ashamed to admit it's 4 now.
Yeah, 2 now. That's,
Question is how wide? How many shots did you have in your coffee?
Yeah, I'm just impressed by that, Gavin. There's nothing else to say. I'm impressed.
I was going to say, we're talking per coffee, Marco, or cumulatively?
Cumulatively.
9 so far today.
Oh my goodness. That is caffeine heaven.
That's part of why my webcam's turned off. I'm actually just twitching in the corner.
All right, well, we might make a start then, and clearly we're going to see that Gavin's going to be, in his part of the presentation, going to be going very quickly. So those of you, we will be able to send this webinar out on demand and be able to slow that down by a half so you can just absorb all of Gavin's caffeine-induced wonderfulness. All right, so thanks again for joining us. This is the 5th in our series of our Wednesday webinars, and thanks for sticking with us over the last month. Just a reminder that you can get any of these webinars on demand at the landing page, which you might have already signed up for through here. Just a reminder that next week we've got a follow-up in the process mining webinar that we ran a few weeks ago with Ian Edwards from Leonardo and Marcello La Rosa from Apremor, and they'll be doing more of a deep dive into the process mining tool. And that'll be a lot of fun, just illustrating practical use case examples. We'll probably then take a break for maybe a couple of weeks. And then once we take a break, we'll have a few more other webinars lined up. But today I'm delighted to introduce the team here. We've got Marco, who is a consulting principal from Leonardo.
Hey guys.
Jobgas, who's a senior consultant, and Gavin Curry, who's a senior consultant with Leonardo too. And they're going to be talking about how you start to leverage a process-centric approach and modern technology to achieve and maintain compliance. So I'll sit back today and enjoy my coffee and let the guys take over from today. Marco.
Yeah, well, I think I might give a prize to anyone that can say my surname and Phil's surname properly. But good luck. So thanks for that, Daniel. And thanks, Phil and Gavin, for joining us today. It's been really good working with you guys recently. And we're going to try and get through an understanding of what is compliance. How do you look at it from a process-centric point of view? Because as we all can understand, compliance is a pretty big thing out there in the world, not just the business world. And then we're going to see, well, if we're going to be able to look at it from a process-centric point of view, are we able to use technology? There's all sorts of technologies out there that do it. Are there process-centric technologies that can help us manage and understand compliance? And finally, we will most probably do a bit of a demo and show you some of that process mining that Daniel was teasing you with. And Gavin, if his caffeine has kicked in, will go at 1,000,000 miles an hour and share that. So Phil, I suppose my question to you would be, what types of compliance have you been seeing in the industry recently? I know you've been doing a gig at an insurance company. A couple of our other consultants have been in superannuation companies, and a couple of us are invested outside of that, both from personal and non-personal ways, to restaurants, which are definitely being impacted on compliance at all sorts of levels. So we'll keep on that flavor as we go through and share a couple of those examples later on. But what are the types of compliance that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. So business process compliance is really only one type, and we've listed here a couple of other examples. So business process compliance primarily being concerned with how we run processes, what kinds of inputs and outputs are being gathered and created, and we want to make sure we differentiate something like a conduct compliance from that. What we have certainly seen recently is that the conduct of employees of organizations, for example, is more heavily being governed. So employees have to behave fairly, they have to treat customers transparently, and they have to be honest in their interactions. So these are things that don't necessarily fall into the process bucket. We have seen a lot of compliance in the data and systems space. So the EU data regulation comes to mind there. We know that organization design is now being governed as well. So organizations are being forced to designate accountable people for certain areas, for certain products. And then workforce management, which is a really interesting one. And so on the one hand, we can have salary compliance there. Do we pay people accurately? There's been a lot in the media around the vacation, accumulation of vacation recently, but also sometimes laws and regulations dictate a particular type of training that our employees have to do. And then finally, anything and everything related to product compliance. So for example, when we build a building, we do want to make sure that the product, the building in the end complies with certain standards as well. And so this is really just to say, business process in the world of compliance is just one of the different types.
I've heard a lot about obligations. So particularly from you in the insurance camp, what do we mean by obligations?
Yeah, an obligation is something that we are being asked or forced to do by a law or a regulation. And an obligation, we're going to touch on that in a little bit later in a bit more detail. But it's really just a granular statement about what we have to do or how we have to do something.
Okay, so then if this is the different types of compliance, how would you translate that into process compliance? What does process compliance mean to us?
So everybody loves a good definition. So here's our take on it. Process compliance means executing a process in line with the controls placed on it. Nice and abstract, and I promise that we will make it a bit more tangible for this presentation. But really that's what we mean by it. A process is designed in a very particular way, and a process has controls baked into it. We are being asked to do something. How do we control for that in our business process? And then how do we make sure that that actually happens in reality? And so some of the reasons for an increased focus on process compliance are that the number of relevant laws and regulations is continuously increasing. Things like the Royal Commission have placed a big burden on banks and insurers, but even before the Royal Commission, there were a lot of changes already underway that place additional burden on organizations. What we're starting to see as well is that the compliance requirements, so exactly those obligations, are becoming increasingly complex and principle-based. So previously, a particular law might have outlined very clearly and directly what organizations have to do, whereas now we find that laws and regulations start to overlap. They sometimes contradict each other, and they're not very clear on what we actually have to do anymore. So an obligation like you have to treat your customers honestly and fairly, and you have to service their requests timely and efficiently, that's principle-based. What does that actually mean? It's not clearly outlined in the legislation, and organizations have to work it out themselves because, and that's really the third point, the regulator's ability to detect non-compliance is improving. And on the one hand, that is they are coming to organizations and they are asking for very particular bits and pieces of data and for more and more data. But on the other hand, what we have also seen is that regulators go out there and they talk to customers directly. And that's a really interesting and new approach for them to be able to basically do a double check on what they're hearing from the companies that they are regulating. Are you guys telling us everything that's really happening?
So I suppose if we apply that to the restaurant world, there was a lot of noise that came out there when they said, oh, we've got to be 1.5 meters spaced. And people start going, well, in what way? If we are feet are 1.5, but we're leaning in towards each other, are we 1.5? And people start to take those requirements and try and understand what it means. It gets very complicated very quickly if it isn't very well defined. I think people are also getting smarter at hiding things from quality control people. We used to say what you do and do what you say and then prove it. Because if you can't, what happens is we start to hide stuff from the regulators or from the quality people, and they don't get a view of what's really going on within a business or an organization. So I suppose this all comes down to our requirements, right? What are the type of requirements and compliance requirements that should be governing what we do? As they get better, I know that the global economy, the Global World Health Organization will push down ideas, guidelines from the G20, the G7, G5, whatever Gs are out there, and also the various treaties that are in place. And they'll push that into countries, which will then impact us like COVID has very, very quickly. Different countries doing different things, trying to learn from each other on the fly. And that will flow through our federal systems, our state systems. Different countries operate in different ways, right the way through to our Corporations Act. So these are a source of requirements that come and are fed down into how we need to comply in our everyday business world. What are the other ones that you've experienced, that you've seen in the insurance world?
Yeah, what we want to propose is that compliance is broader than just laws and regulations. And whilst that is an important bucket and source of requirements, really internal policies and requirements are the second bucket that we want to emphasize. So really starting at the organization's strategy, if we go out there and we outline a particular set of objectives that we're trying to achieve, whether that is efficiency, whether that is the quality of our product, or maybe the satisfaction of our customers, then we have to make sure that our processes and our process design also complies with those requirements. And then there's the usual amount of internal policies that we can find, something like a segregation of duties policy, something like a 4 eyes principle. So requirements where if we don't comply with them, it doesn't mean that necessarily somebody's going to sue us, but it means that we're not going to achieve our internal goals. And finally, the third bucket as a source of requirement is standards and agreements. Service level agreements are really broadly used across pretty much all industries nowadays. So if we go out and we say that we will service customer requests within 2 days or 3 days, then that is now a source of requirement that our process has to comply with. And in addition to that, we might even say that certain internal processes, whether that is process improvement, project management, have to comply with set standards like Lean, Six Sigma, Prince2. So if we say we subscribe to that standard, we're implementing the standard, then we have to again demonstrate in our business process design that we're actually doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you also touched on a point there about customers, right? So compliance is those scales, balancing what is the desired outcome from guidelines and input that's coming from government regulations, from organizations, from laws, and also how well are we meeting the requirements for our customers? How are we really meeting their needs, or are we taking advantage of them? How well linked is that to our strategy of what we're trying to do as a business, and making sure that we can objectively show that, yes, we are achieving those objectives. We are concerned for the customer. So without a process of what we do and understanding how that's properly governed, can you share a little bit about the opportunities that these type of laws, regulations, and compliance requirements come down, and how we can, I suppose, talk to that from a process perspective?
Yeah, and it really comes down to understanding the context of our process and making sure that we accurately understand the places in which compliance is hitting us, in which those requirements are hitting us. Previously, we might have seen that compliance is primarily concerned with outputs of a process. Have you created the right thing in the right amount of time? What we're seeing increasingly is that that scope is being broadened, and that things like inputs to a process are now also governed. And so that is a good example in the insurance space. If you submit a claim, then there is an obligation on the insurer that they're not allowed to collect any data from you that does not directly relate to the claim that you have just submitted. So that is something where we just have to be a little bit more conscious about the holistic environment that our process operates in. The governance of process activities has been around for a little bit as well. And so that could be, if you reach a certain step, you have to notify the customer, for example. The final bucket is the enabler bucket. And so these are things like data security laws and regulations, policies that govern how we use IT systems in an organization, and policies that might govern how we design call center scripts or certain procedures, for example. And so really here, the point being that we need to establish a holistic understanding of our business processes and make sure that we systematically understand the source of requirements and what exactly they are impacting in our organization.
So I suppose there's a couple of examples that we've already spoken through or spoken to, and I don't think we need to go into it in this particular slide. So what I'd like to understand, though, is how do we ensure that we are complying, and what are the things that we have to avoid, like the lack of certain things in a process that we need to understand?
Yeah, so here are some of the causes that we've seen of non-compliance. And so initially there might be a lack of awareness. People and organizations simply not knowing that there were certain compliance requirements. We might have a lack of enabler support. So everybody wants to do the right thing, but if the call center script that is being read to customers is inaccurate and is non-compliant, then every execution of that process is going to be non-compliant as well. We have seen in the past a lack of enforcement. So everybody was aware that there's non-compliance, but nobody really cared. Nobody was too concerned about it. Lack of appreciation. So executing a compliant process is too complicated, it's too cumbersome. I know that I'm certainly guilty of that one. So everybody probably knows the example of just walking over to your mate at the IT service desk, gets your request done and completed really, really quickly, rather than going through the ITIL compliant process. So that's certainly a big cause of non-compliance, as well as the deliberate non-compliance as well. So people deliberately trying to game the system. And I suppose what we're wanting to do here is propose an approach and a few ideas for how we can tackle these causes of non-compliance.
Fair enough. So then if we want to try and manage this, there's got to be ways, as you said, people can easily avoid, or we're getting clever at how we can avoid, even though the regulator's getting more clever on how they can actually detect and watch compliance. For example, too many people meeting in a particular place. Cops show up and go, why is there 50 people here? And you wonder who dobbed you in. But in fact, they say, no, we could tell that there were 50 mobile phones within a short distance of each other, and it's on a private property, therefore it's breaking the law. So how do we use technology to help us be compliant? We don't want to be caught out. And if we're law-abiding citizens and we want to move towards the intent of a lot of these compliance things for safety, health, and all sorts of other things, even business performance, right? How do we do that from a technical point of view?
I would like to propose a 3-step approach. So we're consultants, and life fits into a 2x2 matrix or into a 3-step approach. In this case, it's the latter. But the first thing that I really want to suggest is visualizing compliance. Making sure that we understand all of our compliance requirements, regardless of which one of the buckets that we initially showed they come from. And making sure that we then trace our process and system design to those obligations, as well as the risks that those obligations pose to us. So it's really important to do that in a visual way, because people can immediately see where those key risks are in their business process, and they can see whether the controls that are in place are actually sufficient for that. The second step is to then move towards automated prevention of non-compliance. So what we want to do is we want to design automated preventative controls rather than relying on manual detective controls. So we really want to look at technology and making sure that people are stopped from doing something that is non-compliant, rather than running a report in a 3 months' time that tells us that we had a number of breaches in the last quarter. Finally, it's about effectiveness measurement. So how do we make sure that the controls around our process are effective? And how can we make sure that there's clear owners assigned to those risks and those controls? Because what that allows us to do, it allows us to also then look at the controls that are still manual and detective. It is perfectly fine to have an environment where some controls are automated and some are manual. Control design and good process design is always looking at the most cost-effective use in which we can achieve compliance. And what we're suggesting here is that by automating where it makes sense and ensuring effectiveness where it doesn't, we have a good approach to making sure that we're compliant across the board.
Yeah, look, I think that's great. And from the many years that I've been exposed to various compliance systems, from a business level, not necessarily at business process level, I've been able to see that those 3 areas are systematically applied across that, and it is a good approach. How would you then take that and put that into a more detailed process? Now, I suppose looking at our time, I don't really want to go into this in a lot of detail, but I thought we could get Gavin to bring up an example of a simple process, and how do we then take that process model, because modeling is an important aspect. It's visual. It helps us understand what's going on because we're graphical beings. We can then put certain boundaries, scoping, criteria, measurements, all these sort of things to it. But for the sake of today's discussion, I'd like to just see a little example of maybe how we go through that, and what value would that provide? How do we get good graphical views of process models? Can we utilize things like process mining to help us visualize what we're actually doing in systems, if we can trust the data? If the data is cleaned, then we're not pushing the compliance levels on that. But generally, systems tell you what that is. And if that extrapolates out, we can then monitor it and make changes on the fly, understanding how well we're complying. So I suppose I'd like to segue into bringing Gavin on to show us a little bit about maybe what a process type of repository can do in this space.
Thanks, Marco. I will try and moderate my speech just in case those coffees are still kicked in, or please tell me via chat to speed up if they've worn off and I'm talking at glacial pace.
No, you're perfect at the moment.
Oh, thank you, Marco. Always appreciate a vote of confidence. What you should be able to see on your screen now is a relatively straightforward process view.
Yes.
This is from an insurance company that essentially sells insurance online. So I'm sure that probably everybody on the call has been through this previously. And what we know through doing this is that there are various opportunities for risk and controls to be applied through the process. I know this isn't a semantically correct BPMN 2.0 model, but it certainly suffice for the purposes today.
Well, it's obviously simple enough for Daffy Duck to understand.
Daffy Duck has been doing a lot of work in this space for us lately. Even though some of his work is despicable, we seem to carry on regardless. So essentially we see with the process, the customers logging in, we've documented a risk here of identity theft associated with that. So straight away, we can see, just based on the brief details included by Daffy, the customer logins may not be secure. There's opportunity for people to do identity theft and exposes the business to risks of chargeback or compliance breaches. In order to mitigate that, we have a control that's been put in place. The control is two-factor authentication, both to ensure that the customer is correctly identified, but it also provides an auditable artifact for us to show that we've complied with the legislative privacy requirements in this instance. Likewise, as we move through, you can see there are various risks and controls associated with the different tasks of the process. For example, here, when we request the insurance quote, one that I know that Marco generally likes to do because he hates putting his hand in his pocket, he will go through
with that.
Adjusting details in an insurance quote and look to try and get the cheapest possible premium. Now that's fantastic for Marco. He's able to get his price down. But from my perspective as the insurer, it is potentially exposing me to fraud or to additional risk because Marco may have made false declarations around security installations at his house or in his car, the age of the assets. I know that Datsun is really not worth 30 grand, Marco, but
well,
yeah,
at least
in driving it.
You're calling me an asset. My age really is immaterial.
So then we put some policy conditions in place. Now, from my perspective, if I'm looking at this strategically, I would say, okay, legally, I'm protected. I have a clause in the policy conditions that identify if Marco is not truly honest, then I don't have to pay his claim. Strategically, though, I know that that's not really going to be the right thing to do, purely because my customer promise or my strategic objective here is that I am an advocate for Marco. As a client, I want to protect him as a member of my insurance group. I want to make sure that I'm looking after his rights. So I need to do something to probably just go, actually, is allowing him to do this and to attempt to game the process consistent with what's in his best interests. So by documenting as part of a process, I can clearly see this is what's happening. If I move over into a repository that manages some of these risks and controls, and I'll use that two-factor authentication as an example control, what I can see relatively easily is the plan here is for a customer to complete two-factor authentication via their phone. It's linked to an internet security risk in a documented process. I can also see that that was due for review on an annual basis back on the 18th of April, and it hasn't been done yet. So if I'm a risk and compliance manager or I'm conducting an internal audit, I know that I need to chase that up. And I can go back to my catalogue here and I can see exactly who is accountable and responsible for that. I could also go into the risk catalogue and I can have a look and see what are the trends. So I can see, for example, in internet security down here, the responsible person happens to be me. So I'll have a long, hard look at myself after the call. The probability is rated as green, but I obviously need to have a look at the impact as part of the review, and the trend lines will adjust accordingly. So the real value from a business perspective or at an enterprise level is you can have somebody who is dedicated to process compliance, privacy audits, or even external audits that has the ability to relatively easily review the risks and controls that apply across your process repository. And you can also have the same controls and risks applicable to multiple process models. Coming back to something you asked about, Marco, if I move over into a process mining perspective, really the value that I'm going to get out of this in a compliance perspective is seeing how these process controls operate in real terms. So I have a simple event log here relating to the process. As we can see, the data is showing that process as we identified it earlier. So the customer's logged in, requested a quote, they may have gone down a no sale path, they may have bought insurance and it gets converted. If I increase the level of detail, I can see all of a sudden that the process isn't as simple as what we thought. Mm-hmm. If I arrange these things slightly differently, we can see that effectively the customers come in, but then obviously Marco's got involved because he's looped in this quote requested 150 times. So I know from a process ownership perspective, that's telling me that he's gaming the system or he's trying to change different things to say, how can I get a cheaper price? One of those things I know up in the top left is I can change the excess level to determine the premium price. And when I go through and have a look at this, off the sales, the majority are sitting at that $2,000 excess or even the $1,600 excess. Anybody that's going for a lower excess, higher premium trade-off is generally not purchasing. So that's skewing my product portfolio. So you can also then start to apply that across tiers of insurance. We know the majority of people are going top tier insurance. So we're actually going high value insurance product, low premium, high excess. That's going to start to throw a whole lot of risk around my debt book and around my potential exposure if the customers are committing fraudulent activity. So I might want to have a look and say, okay, are we looking at commercial customers? No, primarily residential, mitigates the risk to a certain extent because it's generally going to be a lower exposure than it would be in a commercial context. And from an insurance type, we can see we've probably got an even split car insurance for most people, not many taking property insurance by itself or a combined policy there, which is where I'm going to be most liable. So what I can then do is come back into my process risk catalog and my control catalog, and I can see, do I have appropriate controls here? Alternatively, if I go back to my process view, how am I going to improve that? I might want to put in an automated step here, which essentially says, if somebody loops back and requests an insurance quote more than 3 times, I want to put a banner advertisement on the website, which says, looks like you're trying to get the best possible price. Click yes to have a chat to our friendly consultant, Phil, who can talk you through a custom quote for your need. That's going to help to identify any potential fraud activity that's going on, in gaming that's happening, and also make sure that we get a sale there that looks after the customer's interests as well as our own.
Yep, and a more appropriate product offering, I suppose.
Absolutely, and that will then ultimately help with the sale confirmation past the ending of the cooling off period, which ultimately is what we're about here, is providing that value to the customer.
That's good. So understanding the process, and I presume that process mining can pull the data out of the systems, give this graphical view that we can then do our analysis and understanding both within this mining tool and also then when you're looking to enhance or put steps in or manual steps around it, or whether you throw a web bot in there or something, you can then build that in and then see how that performs later. So closing off that compliance loop.
It absolutely does, but at the risk of going down a rabbit hole, Marco, I'd invite you to join our webinar next week where you'll be able to explore that in more detail.
Well, an invitation like that I could not refuse, Gavin, so no doubt I will see you there. And I presume Daniel will present that information later on. I suppose for now, what I'd like to see is any questions around particularly the process-centric viewpoint of how we could do process compliance within an organization through business process modeling. And maybe if we bring up that slide of the 4 stages from model through to execute and governance or the compliance loop, that can then help us do compliance properly, because often we're not doing it very well. And I would love to hear from those that have been able to see this as to what your thoughts are. That's the one I'm looking for. Beautiful. So what are your thoughts in process compliance? And I think there
So
are
we've
some
got
questions.
they've got a couple of questions. So here's one from Robert. What if my organization does not have a current view of their business process? How do you ensure compliance?
Okay, well, I'll take that one, Phil, if you don't mind. I believe it depends. I suppose my question would be, what extent do they have a view? If it's absolutely nothing, in other words, it's sitting in everybody's brains, in their heads, or in spreadsheets that only one or two people have access to, then I would seriously look at, well, what is that journey? How serious is it to be compliant? What is the risks around not being compliant? And if they are quite substantial, then look at putting in place some mechanisms, look at technology that can help you support that and ensure that you start closing off that loop. We would obviously want to understand that a little bit more to be sure that we're not just going, yeah, go and buy technology and that's going to solve your problem, because it most probably won't. It really depends where your data is, the quality of that data, how quick it'll take to cleanse. And that can then give you a rapid view compared to the traditional methods of sending out a bunch of business process analysts to model and graphically represent the business. It doesn't have to be bigger than Ben-Hur, but if you want to make sure you close off the loop, then you've got to digitize it in some way. Otherwise, it becomes fairly cumbersome.
Another question from Paul: is it realistic to have this modeling view of your value chains?
Do you want to take that one, Phil?
Yeah, sure. We like to think it is, of course. So it doesn't take much time, and there's a lot of accelerators out there that can be used to establish a basic view, a high-level view of an organization from a business process perspective. And some of that can be reference architecture, some of that can be work that already has been done in organizations. What we certainly have seen is that within the risk and compliance areas, people naturally tend to think in processes, but they may not necessarily document them as processes. So I think that we can definitely leverage existing work that's already been done to then quickly pull that together. The beauty of a visual view of these things is, as opposed to something like an Excel sheet or a combination of Excel and PowerPoint, is that it then becomes a truly sustainable and scalable solution. We could say that we simply push compliance management down into particular business units and say, you go and deal with it whichever way you want to deal with it. But restructures get in the way, people moving on get in the way, and trying to manage the version history of these types of documents is a bit of a pain anyway. So establishing a value chain view doesn't take much time at all, and having it in a good tool certainly helps then maintain it and make sure that it's communicated well across the organization.
And I think to add to that, Phil, it depends on how big your organization is. So the bigger you are, the more complexity there is, the more handoffs, the more data entry, the more all these other complexities that need to be eliminated. So a single view of what is done by who is always very important. I don't think you could just do it at that value chain level. It's got to be down into the further details in order to ensure complexity. But there again, that's where technology has advanced to be able to help us to do that.
I've got a question for Gavin, and I don't want to spoil anything that's going to be presented next week, but how is process mining, and has it changed the way, it's a relatively new thing. How's it changed in recent years to provide, I suppose, a confident view of process models? Can you trust the data, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
I like that last little question there, Dan. Can you trust the data? The answer to that is always yes and no. A healthy dose of skepticism goes a long way in this game. You can often find your data skewed by test accounts, by denial of service attacks, by customers trying to game the process, by consultants or internal staff doing the same thing. So it does need a level of SME knowledge and understanding of what you expect to see, so that you can do that initial sniff test on it. I think with some of the, I guess, advances in technology and approaches with process mining over the last few years, what I've really noticed is a definite trend towards the more proactive forms of process management and compliance management. So traditionally, we've seen a lot of business process management improvement activities or compliance models coming from a reactive approach, i.e. either ourselves or a competitor has had a breach. There's been an issue in the media that we've noticed, and we're essentially going to check whether we've got a level of protection against a similar issue ourselves. What we can do with process mining these days is really get on the front foot and say, what's the difference between how we believe the processes operate and how a customer experiences that? And where are the gaps or the challenges, or even the loopholes that a customer is always going to find, or that a user will find, that we don't know about? And that's really something that becomes critical, because it's very difficult to be completely impartial about a process you've designed yourself or that you operate with every day. Human nature says that we're always going to believe we're doing the best job possible, and it helps to get that independent, objective perspective. The other element that would come into that question, though, is that predictive process monitoring perspective. So the capability of some of the process mining tools out there to link back to your data source, whether that's your ERP platform or your digital environment, whatever it happens to be, they can actually pull live data and use machine learning to take a view across historic data inputs and say, based on what's happening here and what Marco's doing on the website today, there's probably a 70% chance that that process is going to result in a specific outcome. And if that's not what we want, then let's do something different. And if we take this particular action at this particular point, what does that do to the end outcome? And you can start to model that sort of behavior before you go and do your A/B tests, before you make a change in production and incur the cost. And that way you can really stress test the upstream and downstream impacts to your business and to your customer experience. So you're able to do things a lot more quickly now, but you're also able to really evaluate that process and your compliance approach from a 360-degree perspective.
That answers my question. More than actually what I was asking. That's awesome. Last question. This one's from Angela. Who is doing process-centric compliance successfully today?
Phil, did you want to give that one a go?
Many organizations are doing process compliance to varying levels of, to varying extents, I suppose. So what we certainly see is that the basics around an understanding of processes and understanding of risks and controls certainly is there, in particular in the financial industry, because of the strong emphasis on that. Where we're probably seeing some more of the gaps is then in the design of effective controls and in the use of technology to then help prevent non-compliance. There's sometimes a bit of a syndrome of it's easier to not invest into compliance upfront and then pay for the breaches later, because that comes generally out of a different bucket. Whereas if you're going into a program and you're saying, I need X thousands or millions of dollars to design some really good controls, that's unlikely going to go ahead. So in that beginning section around process modeling, that's really good. Process execution in certain parts, looking at things like RPA, that's certainly starting to get there. But really that whole loop is something that's only coming up now, and where we're working with some really good customers on that.
The other part of that I might just add on, Phil, and coming back to the point about who does it well. There is a difference in trends across industries and also locations. So a lot of European companies that have been working with GDPR requirements and regulations for an extended period now have very good process compliance awareness, along with auditable artifacts. We're seeing that more in Australia with the outcomes of the Royal Commission into open banking. Some of the things that are starting to come through around the consumer data right and the express desire of the federal government to take that economy-wide. where some of those compliance elements are being forced upon industries and organisations. But you also start to see with a lot of the digital disruptors that are coming in, the low-cost startups that are challenging established conventions in a range of industries, compliance is actually something that's inherent to what they do from an agile and a digital development perspective. They're very conscious of things like cybersecurity, customer experience, and locking things down, because ultimately a lack of compliance control is essentially going to result in increased rework, increased cost to the business, and greater variation and waste in your processes. So the simpler you can design something and the more concrete you can make it so that a customer is channeled directly down happy path, the better the outcome both for the customer and your operating costs. So there are really a few different areas where it's coming almost bottom up and top down. And it's a very interesting space to keep an eye on over the next 18 months in Australia.
Another sort of question, sorry, this is the last question. Sam has sort of commented on that that the thing you touched on just then. So he says, where complex regulations exist, the processes need to reflect that. How do organisations remain agile while compliant?
Yeah, and I suppose Gavin did touch on a fair bit of that, because I saw that question come through, Daniel. So Sam, I suppose my answer to that would be that you've got to have a clear linkage. Number one, a clear understanding of your strategy in your organization. And then you've got to have a clear linkage of where does that sit in the context of the world, because no organization is independent on its own. So how you've got to put through scenarios about what if things go wrong like COVID, how would we adapt? How would we reflect? You can't focus on that wholly and solely, but you do have to address some of those tough questions about if they automatically brought out open banking, what impact would that have on our organization? Otherwise, you'd end up having a Kodak moment where you're no longer in business because you do film and everything's gone digital. I think a lot of technology that's there, as Gavin said, is quick. The startups are coming out with good software that is being able to link strategy through the business process to the compliance and the regulations that are impacting on that. And whether you've got to make a decision to stop a particular process or adapt one, being able to see them, being able to report on understanding impact analysis on the process, who's doing what systems are supporting it, what processes should we have in place, you can then very quickly do analysis rather than spending a lot of time and money trying to understand the impact of it when that regulation comes out. You've got the information, you just need to decide how to adapt. That's what gives you that agility. So information is critical, put together in data and graphical models, understanding it, how it links through the process that delivers value is what keeps us agile, linking our strategy to what our customers should be getting. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Paul and Angela and Noah, for those questions. So that is it for today. Thanks for joining us again. So next week, we'll be talking about process mining. So it'll be a live demonstration of Apremore tool in a lot more detail. And then in the following weeks, we'll also have future webinar series and a few different types of webinars, some ask me anything types of webinars, and we're looking to have a debate from a couple of our subject matter experts on RPA versus API versus ESB integration. So that'll be fun. Thanks very much, Phil. Thanks very much, Marco. Thanks very much, Gavin, for your excellent presentation today. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.